The thing about CRPGs is that it takes a long time to play them, so my decision to review Avernum was one I took comfortably over a year ago. I've been chipping away at it here and there, adamant that I wouldn't start this video until I got to the end, and I'm very glad I did, having finally played through the entirety of a Spiderweb Software game. Not something I've done before. I've been 2/3 of the way through at least 6 of them. I feel I was correct in the assumption that the video would feel more complete, and the accompanying gameplay footage a tad more varied and interesting, in comparison to the Exile 3 vid that I did, where I think I only played through about a quarter of the game, before any of the interesting world development events had taken place. That's what attempting to do a video every 3 weeks resulted in. Anyway, welcome to Yesteryear's Mac Games, where the subject of interest today is the Y2K rewrite of 1995's Exile, Escape from the Pit. This is Avernum, which took the content from Exile, gave it a polish and a few extensions, and plopped it in a newer game engine that the author, Jeff Vogel, had first used for Nethergate from the previous year. Jeff likes to remake his old stuff an awful lot, and explained why in an interesting blog post. In it, he details that in the suddenly lots of revenue and then barely any revenue world of indie games, remakes are hugely beneficial for stability, padding out the release cycle and enabling more work to be put into the next completely new offering. That said, in this particular case, Avernum still took 9 months to develop. Avernum's second remake came along in 2011, and at the time of recording, a remake of Avernum 4 is currently in the works, having just done rather well on its Kickstarter. Anyways, in this overhaul, the top-down 9x9 grid was replaced with a pseudo-3D isometric viewpoint that, with the help of the increased resolution from 640x480 to 800x600, could display a lot more. The player's party of 6 adventurers were simplified to a party of 4, the spell list was smartened up a bit, the amount of dialogue in the game was doubled, with Exile's keyword guessing game that one had to undertake to progress conversations removed in favour of having all responses listed visually. Side point, I did bump into one instance where I think the old text had missed the name update. In terms of the world itself, a heap of new quests, events, and locations were added, and various dungeons were reconfigured and improved. This was not an insignificant overhaul, and naturally, casting off a name as generic and widely used as Exile in favour of something that could have its own identity would be a no-brainer as well. Avernum is almost a real-world name, a small tweak to the already taken Avernus, which was an ancient name for a volcanic crater in Italy that the Romans believed was the entrance to the underworld. Distributed as shareware for Macintosh and Windows, Avernum was available as a download from the internet, and was also present on magazine cover discs. Players could quest around about 20% of the game without paying, which is an immense amount of gameplay to give out and enables players to get fully engrossed into the underground world, its inhabitants, and the many, many threats. I played this demo back in the day on System 7.6, and further down the line, patches became available that would run it natively on System 10. It doesn't work on modern Macs, it doesn't work on modern Windows, but it does work on the Steam Deck through Valve's compatibility layer. Although button input is a bit too fast, so trying to position one's characters correctly during a battle is less than straightforward. Cool to see nonetheless. I feel that the premise of Avernum is one of the biggest draws for me, as spending an entire game in an underground world illuminated by a roof of glowing fungi is quite unique. The intro text explains that the surface world is ruled over by a tyrannical empire, who discovers the caverns underneath and, after a few expeditions of varying success, eventually regards it as a handy solution for the disposal of anyone they didn't like, from criminals to losers of power struggles, from misfits to unlucky souls who farted next to the wrong official. They're all thrown down through a portal, and come out the other end, dazed and confused, in Fort Avernum. The game begins with the player's band of 4 picking themselves up and making sense of their new surroundings. After a bit of chit-chat with some NPCs, the gang will find themselves engaged in a rumble almost immediately. Each town visited has its own problems, spanning bandits, basilisks, giants, Nephilim, which in this game are humanoid cats, and Slith Serakai. Most of these problems tend to be solved by journeying over to the respective fort or dungeon and emptying it of its inhabitants, with each of these typically taking me a few visits, as partway in, my magic users would run out of MP, and all party members would find themselves holding as much spoils as they could, which would then need to be sold off before anything else could be picked up. So, out we would repeatedly trot, back to the nearest town, to recharge and hawk the piles of swords and spears that had accumulated. One shortcoming that I encountered a few times occurred when there was a bit of a gap between my play sessions. More often than not, I would have forgotten which dungeon or fort or whatever I was halfway through, leaving it half finished as I charged off to go and do something else. Future Spiderweb games did eventually get a quest log that alleviated this, but Avernum had to make do with a simplistic journal function where clicking this book records the currently displayed words for later review. I resorted to crossing things off on a piece of paper. Old school problems require old school solutions. This worked well until I misplaced it. Killing things and completing quests are the main source of experience points, with the characters able to progress through 40 levels. Each one comes with skill points that improves attributes, with a balanced party boasting their own distinct roles being the suggested way to play. I went for 2 melee fighters with different specialties, a mage, and a cleric archer. The dialogue is one of the things that keeps questing interesting. Background lore on Avernum's history, residents, and geography paints a captivating struggle to survive against all the odds, and manages to avoid a number of the typical fantasy game tropes that one would normally expect. The originality in this has of course been cooking for some time, as new ideas built upon the 1995 incarnation of the game. A number of themes, however, predate even that, with Jeff having first introduced them into the Dungeons & Dragons games that he ran. While the game's plot and goings-on is progressed in walls of text, it never feels unnecessarily wordy. It is sensible and to the point during major moments in the plot, but could occasionally contain a dry and abrupt humour that frequently got a smirk out of me. As far as visuals go, obviously they were a step up from what came before, but even as the game released, reviews tended to tout the graphics as a bit old school. To understand that, if one casts their mind back to the late 90s, the biggest commercial CRPGs of the time, such as the first Baldur's Gate, Fallout, and EverQuest, had transitioned to polygons, or at the very least had pre-rendered 3D. There's a small amount of that in Avernum, but ultimately most things remain sprites. Through today's eyes, I have to say the game does look a little drab. It does make sense that the world is a collection of greys. An underground world of caverns lit up by a ceiling of glowing mushrooms isn't going to comprise of a whole lot more besides rock. I guess the various areas could have had different tints depending on the type of stone. There is a bit of that. Or perhaps the fungi could have added a bit of glow in places, like how people put RGB LED strips behind things now. Naturally, engaging in this sort of variety would extend development time and costs, so it may not have been feasible. Character sprites haven't really gotten more detailed than Exile, but they have gained multiple directions and can now sit down. They also gained a bit of artwork, which is nice, although some of them do look a little underdressed for the activities they're undertaking. This one doesn't look protected from a chilly breeze, let alone a sword. Sound design isn't too much to write home about either, but it gets the job done. Given that most sound effects are stock, one tends to hear the same thing in all sorts of other games, which would often get me thinking about Avernum when they were used elsewhere. Jeff spoke about using background ambient noise in interviews from around the time, but it would be until Geneforge, 2 games later, for him to implement it, and he wasn't all that fond of in-game music, which usually means that playing the game was accompanied by little more than the sound of the Max case fan, and the clunks of keyboard, if one had chosen to use that over the mouse. Everything has a hotkey, very handy. The game contains a myriad of quests and objectives, which all culminate in the 3 main feats that the player's adventurers aim to accomplish. These are to kill something big and horrid which has been making a nuisance of itself from inside of a bottle, to escape Avernum and return to the overworld, and to take vengeance against the buggers responsible for sending the player's party down there in the first place. These all happen towards the end of the game, and while the prerequisites for this, like assembling a sword and collecting brooches, are staggered throughout a playthrough, to help keep things moving, these are all accompanied by at least 36 side quests to complete, as the player's party makes their way around the map. Some of these are perennial fetch quests, but others give the player a reason to journey to other cities and locations. An alchemist in Darmon, for instance, will task the player to cavort around the map and find a particular book, and the Wizard X asks the player to find a library in Barga so that he may research an anvil-flinging spell. I read that one is a reference to an old Usenet joke. It's difficult to say if I managed to do all these side quests, as there's no in-game list. I'm guessing not though, as I never did find out what was in here. If you know what that's all about, please leave a comment. The pacing is for the most part solid, and the difficulty, when set to standard, is steady. It is easy to run into something unprepared and get squashed, but on the whole, there weren't many situations that I considered unmanageable, beyond a couple of moments where it is possible to softlock a save file by being unable to get through a mandatory fight successfully. I recommend changing save file names fairly often to alleviate this. For the most part, anything too difficult could be left alone for a bit, until the party was stronger. I'm going to briefly dance over some of my favourite parts of the game now. Some of the more memorable fights for me included the Empire Fort, where they kept the communication orb to talk to the surface, which was hidden behind a small gremlin infestation. And the sad business at Fort Remote was an exhilarating fight coming from all directions, which I wasn't expecting and only narrowly scraped through. I was also quite amused the first time I saw a big blue hacky demon, when some of my summoned spiders unexpectedly immobilized it with webs, letting me gradually and safely pelt it with arrows. This happened at the end of a subplot about retrieving a relic from Lost Bar Sikava, which was quite engaging, shedding some info on how the Sliths got into Avernum and why. I really liked bumping into references for things and people that would crop up in later games, from the Venati to the eventual war with the Empire. While irritatingly lethal to begin with, I also quite liked dealing with basilisks, as they can one-hit kill, which necessitates a slightly different strategy for dispatching them, ensuring there was enough summoned creatures to soak up their gazes while my characters got close enough to strike. I found Skaragath to be an interesting spot. A fallen wizard from the first fight against the demon Grahoth stands guard with some other shades to try and talk the player out of releasing the blighter. Ignore them and let him out, and the whole place is then completely decimated for the return journey. Running around the nearby area collecting mandrake for an old witch was also amusing. It turned out that the witch was supposed to be an introduction to the incancentrix Erica, who I'd already met, thereby breaking the sequence. Finally, Jeff likes spiders. He had a tarantula called Spider. His company is called Spiderweb. That might be Spider in the splash screen. Anyway, it is perhaps unsurprising, given all of that one of the most entertaining bits of the game is the cave of friendly elephants. Oh wait, no, spiders. Friendly spiders. This silly bunch of giant arachnids are caught up in their own existence, blissfully unburdened from the complexities of the wider world. Effort was put into this. They even make noises when the player talks to them. Nothing else does that. There is actually something you need from a few of these spindly fellows, although telling them apart is a bit of a nuisance, as they all look the same, and are all called Spider. Contrasting to all of my favourite bits, there were a handful of sections of the game that seemed to drag on a bit. The undead pit at Myrtis, which seems to need a clearing out in every single game, was one such example, and I felt like the various fights through numerous Slith fortresses lasted an unnecessary amount of time. That part of the game just kept going. Finding out that there's a third floor to some of the dungeons was a tad annoying as well, as with no quick way to exit to offload pickups and recharge mana, it takes a while to get out and back in. There are a couple of sections where the light goes out completely, which I hated, and towards the end of the game it became a bit unclear to me as to who I was supposed to talk to next in order to progress the story, which saw me pacing cluelessly around the map for a bit too long, blindly trying various things until I lost patience and went to look at an old walkthrough on Game FAQs. Online resources for the game do still exist. One site, which is surprisingly still online, is Harehunter's Haven, which has a complete set of annotated maps and other useful details and tables for many of the old Spiderweb games. Avernum ended superbly. I thoroughly enjoyed the final sequence rushing to the throne room, and was thoroughly satisfied upon its conclusion. There is, overall, heaps of game in here if this sort of old-school adventure is one's cup of tea. The whole playthrough was a positive experience, and it's gotten me interested in trying out a few more RPGs that the classic macOS has. It may not be too long before I'm covering another one, but with it taking almost all of my retro gaming time over the past 3 months as I knuckled down to get this finished, it's definitely time for something else first. I do recommend fans of the genre give one of the 3 incarnations of this a shot, with the latest one, if you can call a game from 2011 latest, enhancing everything further and bringing the world and its stories to modern computers. It occasionally goes on sale on Steam, so is easily accessible. With 5 sequels, 6 if you count Blades of Avernum, there's plenty more to play after the completion of this one. Which one's the best? I'll let you know when I've gotten through the lot. That could be some time. We'll leave it here then for this edition of YYsMG. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.